You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello and welcome along to the inaugural Today's Family Lawyer podcast. Today I'm joined by Olivia Piercy. Olivia is a partner in the family team at Hunters, which is an organisation based in London. And I have to say, this is a real delight for me, Olivia, because it's the first podcast. It's great to have you on. We've got some really tough things to talk about today, but it's lovely to meet. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Today's Family Lawyer is an online news publication for family practitioners, and you've been kind enough to contribute to the publication recently. And in that interview, you've been discussing the huge raft of legislation which has crept into domestic abuse over the last few years. And I said that this was quite a heavy sort of podcast for a first one, I think. Of the recent developments in the law, which would you consider to be the most important in this space?
It's an interesting question because there has been a huge raft of legislation, as you say, and it spans so many different types of abuse. So we've had the criminalisation of forced marriage, new FGM offences, stalking protection orders, domestic violence protection orders, domestic violence protection notices, Clare's Law, just the Domestic Abuse Act, absolutely loads. I think, interestingly, the most impactful change has probably been the new offence of coercive control, or fairly new offence of coercive control, which it's interesting because when it was first proposed, I remember thinking, what's the point in that? We've already got a criminal offence, which is pretty much exactly the same. So that behaviour, which is caught by the coercive control offence, was already a criminal offence under the Protection from Harassment Act 1997. And if you look at the offence, it basically mirrors it. But I think the reason why it's so impactful is because it's completely changed the way people view domestic abuse. And I think people used to think of domestic abuse as physical violence, and they knew that emotional abuse and psychological abuse was a form, was kind of part of it and something people talked about. But I don't think it occurred to anyone that that should be criminal, or that it had the same impact. I think there's still quite a long way to go in terms of people's understanding of coercive control. But I think that just making it a criminal offence and the kind of media frenzy around that has been hugely helpful in terms of people being able to identify that behaviour as abuse.
Actually giving it a name instead of it just being part of something else feels
Exactly.
like a really important development.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's still an issue with people thinking that coercive control is like a softer form of domestic abuse. It's kind of like tacked on to, the original definition, like it's a lesser form of domestic abuse than, say, physical violence, when actually it's something that's at the heart of all domestic abuse relationships. And physical violence or sexual violence or, financial abuse are just kind of expressions of a domestic abuse relationship, which, has coercive control at its core.
So flip it round. If that's been one of the most effective pieces of legislation, what would you say has been the least effective?
I think domestic violence protection orders and notices are generally considered to have been fairly low impact. We already had injunctions, non-molestation orders that you get from the family court. You've got bail conditions, you've got restraining orders, and the breach of those types of injunctions or breach of bail conditions is a criminal offence. So they're much easier to enforce. Ideally, you should be able to phone up the police and say, here's my non-mol, here's the text message breaching it, go and arrest my perpetrator. Whereas the breach of a domestic violence protection order isn't a criminal offence, it's a contempt of court, and that's just really fiddly. Any lawyer who's been involved in contempt proceedings will know how easy it is to fall down on the drafting. They're fiddly proceedings, and for an already under-resourced police force, the breaches of domestic violence protection orders just aren't really getting pursued, and they haven't had much impact.
Why do you think that is? Is it that the police, for example, simply don't have the resource to go and enforce these things?
Definitely. I definitely think that there's an issue of resourcing. I've spent years speaking to survivors of domestic abuse who have gone and got their non-molestation orders, and when they call up the police and say my non-mol has been breached, and here's the evidence, nothing happens. And that's, I'd say, probably more often than not the case, which just puts people in such a dangerous position. I can only think that it's largely to do with just a lack of resources. I'm not inside the police force, so I don't want to comment on why it's not happening. I just know that it's a massive issue that people get these orders, and then when the orders get breached, they're finding it really difficult to enforce them, and in circumstances where it shouldn't be difficult, where it's a clear-cut criminal offence and they've got evidence, which is why whenever they come up with a new remedy, they say, right, we've got a new kind of order, we're going to simplify the system. You just think, if you're not going to answer the phone, if you're not going to pursue breaches of these orders, what is the point in creating more and more types of orders?
Resourcing, funding, perennial issue in family. We're talking at a time when there's a huge row about legal aid funding. There's huge rows in the barristers sector where obviously there's sort of strike action. Where should the government look to target any increase in funding that they might set aside to support domestic abuse victims?
Legal aid definitely is a massive issue, and I think that there's a real misconception that domestic abuse victims or survivors get legal aid. You do need to have evidence of domestic abuse in order to obtain legal aid for a lot of kinds of family law cases. But even to apply to get legal aid to apply for a non-molestation order, you have to pass a means test, and the vast majority of people in this country will not be considered poor enough to pass the means test in order to get legal aid, and yet will also not have nearly enough money to pay for a lawyer privately, because legal bills, especially if you're litigating, are eye-wateringly expensive. So most people will fall within that gap. So most people, if they want to go to court to protect themselves and their children from domestic abuse, they will have to represent themselves against their perpetrators, which is just a completely unsatisfactory situation, which puts lots of people in danger. So I do think that that's an ongoing issue which is misunderstood and neglected. But there's also just a massive problem with, I think we've got something like 50% of the domestic violence refuge places that we need. There aren't enough IDVAs, that's independent violence advocates. There aren't enough rape crisis centres. We can't get counselling. There is also just life's too expensive. A lot of people stay in domestic abuse situations because they can't afford to leave, or they feel they can't afford to leave. There's so many different directions that resources are needed in all at once in order to create safe spaces for people.
There's two questions that arise out of what you've just said for me, Olivia. One is, does the current cost of living crisis impact the decision of people to leave abusive relationships? Or do you anticipate that actually what we're going to see over the course of the next 6, 9, 12, 18 months, depending on how long this cost of living crisis lasts, a rise in people in these situations?
Both, definitely both. I mean, of course, domestic abuse situations are massively exacerbated by poverty. Relationships fall apart and people suffer from mental health problems, when they're also under extreme financial pressures, when you're in inadequate housing. Of course, the cost of living crisis will exacerbate domestic abuse cases. And at the same time, of course, people are more likely to feel financially trapped and unable to look after themselves, fund themselves, support themselves. when they don't feel they've got the resources to do so. With recent decisions to target benefits, that's a clear example of policy decision within a cost of living crisis, which is going to directly impact domestic abuse victims and survivors, attempting to escape domestic abuse situations.
Before we started recording, you were telling me about some of your experience in this space and, clearly the passion for it. This might be a loaded question, but what's the demographic of people that you're predominantly dealing with in these scenarios? You said that for the most part, people fall through those legal aid cracks.
I think that domestic abuse happens in all walks of life. It's not, a poor person problem. It's not something that only happens to a particular gender or a particular type of person. Domestic abuse is pervasive. There are men who've experienced domestic abuse. There is domestic abuse in same-sex relationships. The overwhelming majority of domestic abuse cases is men against women. That's, just the reality. Although domestic abuse happens in all aspects of life, it's that the experience of domestic abuse is different depending on your demographic. So if you've got money, if you've got, even if you can't afford a lawyer, if you're educated and therefore find it easier to access services, it's going to be easier. In terms of the demographic of people experiencing domestic abuse, I think it's everyone, not everybody. I think it's everywhere. But I just think the experiences of people are so different depending on their resources and their background. Obviously, there's a real issue of there not being enough refuge places, but there's an increasing issue of there not being enough specific refuge places for Black and minoritized women. And those services have gone down disproportionately, even more than general ones. So.
In one of the pieces you've contributed to the publication, you've talked about the way in which technology is now supporting your role in helping people that have been affected by domestic abuse. Could technology be the way forward, a support mechanism for you?
So Smart Water's a brilliant invention. I know it's been, I know that has led to a conviction, quite James Bond gadget kind of idea. I think it could be really helpful in like stalking cases where you've got someone kind of repeatedly prowling around the house and terrifying everybody inside. And yet every time you call the police, there's no evidence that they've been there. So there are kind of limited situations where that would be helpful. Query whether CCTV would kind of do a similar job. But I think that we're not lacking remedies, we're lacking resources. There's not much point in putting these remedies in the hands of police when, you're not getting the response, an adequate response a lot of the time. You're not going to solve the problem of domestic abuse, which is fundamentally to do with a kind of power imbalance with technology or with any remedy. Nobody's looking at the root causes of domestic abuse. They say 1 in 4 women will experience it in their lifetime. There's a lot of focus that's put on, how are we going to help the poor victims? Where can we find them a safe space? What's wrong with women that they get in these situations in the first place? And why won't they just leave? And how can we help them leave? No one's really looking at the perpetrators or why it is that, we're raising all these lovely, innocent little boys and they're growing up not knowing how to love or be in a relationship without trying to control or hurt their partner. That is a massive problem and it's really sad for everyone involved. And until we look at that and try to address that, this problem isn't going to go away. So, it's maybe not specifically what you were first asking, but I don't think Smart Water or CCTV or a new type of domestic violence protection order is going to do anything more than chip away at the top of this iceberg.
You've already alluded to the fact that domestic abuse can be misrepresented. How much does the new age, this digital world that we live in, affect our perception of domestic abuse? Actually, is it being perpetrated in different ways now than it's ever used to have been?
I think social media is an extension of our world, and we live on social media at the same time as we live in our real world, and our relationships happen simultaneously on social media and in the physical world around us. And so of course domestic abuse happens in that space as well, and it's less policed, and there should be it should be easier to find evidence of the abuse happening, but actually it's really easy to hide on the internet and to make someone's life a misery. So social media is a problem. Also, it seems to be surprisingly easy to sort of break into people's accounts. You can always, very easy to stalk people online. Everybody's done it. So for a domestic violence perpetrator, it's a brilliant opportunity to kind of monitor somebody's activity, people they're friends with, etc. And you're just and create another space that they feel frightened and controlled in. And the answer that the victim of domestic abuse should just kind of get off social media is not a fair one. Because often you're talking about people who are already so isolated, and it's just more isolating. So that's an element which is probably more complex. Obviously, there are issues with social media companies not wanting to kind of track their users, and there are very good political arguments for why you wouldn't want to do that, because it's an international space. I come at this from the angle of wanting to make safe spaces for domestic abuse victims and survivors. So I do wish that people would take more responsibility, or these companies would take more responsibility for keeping people safe.
I think some of what you've said, you could probably draw back to the point you made about targeting the cause of domestic abuse, not dealing with the aftermath of it. If we go back to the pandemic, we know that was obviously very bad news for those that were affected by domestic abuse, and people had no choice but to spend more time in the company of their abusers. We're in a slightly different environment now, albeit that we're still largely working from home. You and I are talking, we're working from home. How can policymakers and employers actually think about supporting staff who may be dealing with issues like domestic abuse in an isolated environment?
It's about creating spaces for people to talk about what they're going through. If somebody's in a domestic abuse relationship, they would normally try to leave many times before they actually leave. And there are so many conversations that lead up to that point. And they need safe spaces to talk about what's going on. And so I think that's something that employers could do, is just create opportunities for people to talk about how they're feeling, what they're going through. And it's just really important that if somebody does choose to talk about the abuse that they're experiencing, or what they may be trying to work out whether or not it's abuse at that time, that the response isn't to kind of jump on them and say, well, you've got to do this, this and this, because there are so many reasons why people aren't ready to leave domestic abuse situations yet. And ultimately, nobody can force that, because so much of it is to do with that kind of mental, psychological connection and relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. I think awareness campaigns are so important, and whether that's, when they did that coercive control storyline on the Archers, that had more impact on the number of victims and survivors of domestic abuse coming out and leaving their relationships than almost any legislative change that I can think of that we've been fighting for over the last 15 years that I've been working. So that kind of thing's really important. And I think if you're an employer, then making sure that information is there, that people are aware of where they can seek help, and that everybody is educated. That's a really responsible way of dealing with that topic. And it is something that's such a taboo. If somebody's ill, they know exactly what to do. They tell HR, and everyone's really supportive. If somebody's in a domestic abuse situation, it's a huge secret, and that makes it so much worse. And it's not as if it's uncommon, it's really common.
I think that's a really interesting point. We have a wills and probate publication, today's Wills and Probate, and the issue with Kate Garraway and the fact that she didn't have an LPA when her husband was ill, and she spoke about that nationally on television. That prompted a wave of people to go out and actually consider whether they needed a lasting power of attorney. That in itself had so much more power than, as you say, any of the marketing campaigns, any of the awareness campaigns that law firms and other organizations run. It was really quite incredible. We're heading towards the end of the podcast, but I wanted to ask you very specifically about your thoughts on the Istanbul Convention and whether you think the UK has failed in its obligations to uphold it.
I mean, it absolutely has. We signed the Istanbul Convention 10 years ago. We've spent, I say we, people who've been involved in this campaign, have spent the last 8 years trying to put pressure on the government to ratify it. The government did finally ratify it in July 2022, but announced at the last minute that they weren't going to ratify 2 of the provisions which relate to providing life-saving support to migrant women. So it's only just been ratified. Nothing has been done yet to try and comply with it. In some ways, we already are compliant. So the Istanbul Convention operates in 3 ways. It looks at preventing domestic abuse. It looks at criminal offences, and then it looks at reporting. So holding countries to account. So in terms of criminal offences, we're doing really well. We've criminalised pretty much everything you could ever imagine. Then we've recriminalised it and criminalised it again. So we've got all the criminal offences that you could possibly want. And we had those, we've had those for a long time. So what we're lacking is the prevention side of things, which includes what I was talking about earlier. So, campaigns, awareness building campaigns, and education in schools for kids to do with kind of healthy relationships and misogyny, try to tackle the root causes of domestic abuse, counselling, rape crisis centres, refuge spaces, legal aid, everything that I've kind of talked about so far. The Istanbul Convention sets a minimum standard of what we as a country should be providing. We haven't done anything to try to comply with that. We have some resources, of course we do, but so far we haven't stepped up, so we're really lagging behind. We will have an independent body that comes and checks on how compliant we're being. If you look at the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, we signed up to that, and every so often the independent body comes and checks up on how we're doing on that. We're not doing very well at all. We're not making much effort to comply with it. So I would be obviously thrilled, surprised, amazed if we did suddenly, if the UK government did suddenly take its commitments under the Istanbul Convention really seriously. I do think that domestic abuse is in some ways a priority in this country, in a sense that it's talked about a lot. Politicians love talking about domestic abuse. Successive Tory governments have kind of waved it as a flag and been kind of like the champion of women, but I don't see any real change. And by real change, I mean any change that costs any money. So far, we're massively falling short of our commitments, and I can't see that there's any kind of attempt to comply.
If we were going to sum up this podcast, then, to me, it feels as though there's a real lack of understanding around the root cause of domestic violence and domestic abuse. And there's very little being done in that prevention space, very, very much under-resourced. There's a lot of stuff happening around the criminalisation space. We've talked about the challenges with enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like something that there needs to be a real focus on. over the course of the next few years if we're to really get to grips with actually changing the narrative on domestic abuse.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's unfair to say that nothing changes, and I also just hate that mentality, because actually if you go back 50 years or 100 years, women have it so much better. Of course we do, and children have it better, and there are obviously huge improvements all the time. I think that the thing that I've found so frustrating in the last few years is that there's been this kind of fake advances, which is lots and lots of talk about domestic abuse in government and creating lots and lots of legislation, whilst at the same time kind of behind the scenes pulling funding in real terms from the resources that are required. And that's what's got me so riled up. There are changes. I know that there's increased education in schools around healthy relationships, and the introduction of the coercive control offence has had a big impact. But I do think that domestic abuse is a huge problem which materially impacts the happiness and well-being of so many people, and especially children, and that it should be taken more seriously, and not enough is being done. And it's not enough to just keep making more offences. You have to prioritise it. There's a complacency about why we have this problem, and I don't know if that complacency is because we're prioritising other things, or if it's some kind of squeamishness about who we are and why and why we're behaving in this way. But I definitely think it needs to be prioritised.
And very briefly, is it getting worse?
I don't know. I'm not qualified to answer that. Is it getting worse? It's difficult to say, because you'd have to be really, really, up on statistics, because it's about how people report it. So maybe there was lots of domestic abuse in the past that people either weren't able to identify as domestic abuse because they thought that treatment was normal, or there was no point in them reporting it, or it was too much of a taboo to report it. So I don't know. I know that the reports of domestic abuse are going up and up and up, and there's a small part of me that hopes that that's just because everybody suddenly feels free to talk about the abuse that they're experiencing. But of course, for whatever reason the reports are going up, the fact is that just a vast number of people are experiencing domestic abuse, and we're not meeting that need sufficiently. And most of all, we're not protecting the children who are caught in those situations adequately at all.
It's been a really difficult topic to talk about in a short space of time. This obviously has a huge impact on a lot of people, and a big impact on family law. But it's been fantastic to have you on the podcast, Olivia. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
The Today's Family Lawyer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk. If you're not already, please subscribe to the newsletter, which comes out every Thursday. Thank you very much indeed to Olivia. Thank you very much indeed to you for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.